Thanks very much for inviting me. I really appreciate being able to be here. I'm going to be talking to you about Sibudu, which is in Kwazulu-Natal. It's a very beautiful site, so one of the things that archaeologists do, through talking, is to choose really beautiful areas where we can drive in and spend several months working out in the sunshine in lovely surroundings. So you can see that Sibudu is on the Tongati River in a deep evergreen forest. It's situated about there, about 15 kilometers inland from the coast, 40 kilometers north of Durban. There we go. There's Tongat, there's the sea. This is the shelter itself. It's not actually a cave, but a large rock shelter extending about 50 meters along the cliff face. This is the site, and the excavation is in this region here, covering about 21 square meters. Here is the deep sounding that goes down about 3 meters into the excavation, and a more recent area that the University of Tübingen has begun to excavate now that I've retired officially from excavating this site. The first thing I want you to notice is the stratigraphy here. It's extremely colorful. It's made up of ash and ochreous units and black carbonaceous units from burning. But the point that you really need to understand is that we're not looking at geological layers per se. These are anthropogenic. These are built up by humans living in the site, making fires, making bedding there, throwing away their rubbish. So it's like a large compost heap. And it gradually builds up of layers of different activities through time. These are the ages that we currently have. All the ones that I'm showing you here are on optically stimulated luminescence ages, except for the one at the top, which is a radiocarbon date of 1000 AD. So, first point that you need to understand is that the entire site is Middle Stone Age, other than a very short occupation by Iron Age people, right on the very top. So there's a large hiatus, a large gap in occupation between the Middle Stone Age occupations and then the last people to live in the site, 1000 AD. The oldest ages that we have at the moment are in the region of 77,000 years ago, and this industry we loosely call the pre-Stillbay industry, but I think one of these days Guillaume will be able to give it a new name once we understand fully what's in it and how it fits into the whole Southern African cities. Above that, the Stillbay industry at 70,000 more or less. A hiatus, a gap in occupation, about 5,000 years based on the dates that we have. Then the Housensport industry, 65,000 to 62,000 years ago. Possibly another gap, about 4,000 years in duration, to a long occupation in terms of the number of times that people repeatedly came to the site. But all of the ages, and there are about 15 of them, suggest that it may have been within about a 1,000-year period, all around about at 58,000 years ago. So at that time, the site was extremely popular. Then a gap again in occupation, maybe as much as 10,000 years, and then another pulse of occupation at 48,000 years ago, another gap in occupation, and then another pulse of occupation, about 38,000, and then that very long gap, after which the Iron Age people came in there, maybe for less than a century. Most of my talk is going to be about the Middle Stone Age, but I'd like to show you a very special find that we got from the Iron Age, and that was a cache of beads. Beads that probably came largely from India. The age for that particular occupation from radiocarbon is 1000 AD, but the chemistry on the beads, on the red beads, suggests that they may have been made during the 16th century. So perhaps the cache of beads was buried after the initial occupation of the site. So there's the excavation. Here's the square where the beads were found, this bead cache here. Let's have a look at that. It's quite extraordinary because when I was excavating into a small pit, a little ashy pit, I noticed the beads, and at first I thought that they were still in their strings of necklaces, because there were multiple necklaces there out of these red beads, also strung with little blue ones and some copper ones that are eroding away, conus shells, 2 big conus shells, and some ostrich eggshell beads that I'll show you in a moment. So it looked as though they were still in their strings, but in actual fact they were only lying like that. The string had rotted away. And so in order to get this out whole, I had to spend many, many days very carefully putting resin in here to glue the beads together in their original position. So that took a lot of patience. Here is the other side of the bead cache. Here you see the bead strings very beautifully. And there was an entire ostrich eggshell necklace that I could not preserve entirely that had some seashell beads woven in between it. So it was the first time ever, archaeologically in South Africa, that we were able to reconstruct the design, the pattern of the way that people put beads together for a necklace. And that was rather exciting. The other thing is that ostriches have never occurred in the Sibudu area. The climate is entirely wrong for them. It's too wet. And so those beads would have had to be traded in from somewhere much further away from open grassland environments. But I'm moving away now from the Iron Age down into the Middle Stone Age. And I'm going to be giving you just some of the highlights from the site. I can't tell you everything about it. There are 72 scientific papers written about the site already. So I can only give you a tiny summary of some of the work that's been done there. So a selection first of some of the stone tools from the site. These hollow-based points, as we call them, because they have hollow bases here, presumably to facilitate hafting onto shafts, because we would guess that these may have been stone points that were used as spearheads, and that they would have been hafted maybe with adhesive and bindings onto the shaft spears. And these came from the uppermost layers over here, where the dates are in the region of 37 to 38,000 years ago. So this seems to be a late expression of the Middle Stone Age, and these hollow-based points have only been found in Kwazulu-Natal. So it looks as though it may be a local tradition of stone tool making. And a selection of other tools through time. Sorry, that's the wrong date there. It should be 70,000 years ago. These are some still bare bifacial points, a bifacial point and a bifacial tool that was not a point but was also worked on both faces. Then 65 to 62,000 years ago, we get back to artifacts, sometimes segments because they're the shape of the segment of an orange, with a straight cutting edge and a circular back to it. And those backed areas were blunted to facilitate their hafting into shafts. And by looking at the residues on some of these tools, and I'm going to be showing you those in a moment, it looks as though these segments may have been hafted to create different kinds of stone tools. Anything from spearheads through to the barbs on arrows, and maybe even arrowheads themselves. At 58,000 years ago, there are points, but there are also long blades like this one that are retouched into various kinds of tools, and the bifacial point, like the one over on the right, 48,000 years ago. So bifacial workings on both faces. So they've been very carefully worked on both faces from the edges. Once again, this was probably a spear point for people to hunt with. We have a lot of worked bone at the site. The first piece that I'm going to show you is from this layer here, which is dated 58,000 years ago. This tiny notched rib fragment has 10 notches along it. You can see a fragment here and a fragment there and a whole line. Francesco Derico, who did the careful analysis of these notches, thinks that a retouched tool was used to cut those notches all at one time. So it's not something that was like a calendar where you would mark a notch once a month or whatever you're trying to mark. This was a one-off situation of decorating or marking this piece of bone. We have a couple of other pieces of notched bone like this from Sibudu, but this is the one that is most impressive. We had a radiocarbon date, an AMS date, an accelerator mass spectrometry date on this, and the date came back 29,000 years ago. But we think that that is a minimum age because the piece of bone is slightly burnt, which means that interferes with the age and the possibility of dating it. So we think it far more likely that it really does belong with the 58,000 layer from which it was excavated. There are many, many worked pieces of bone, and most of them come from the 62 to 65,000 layers, in other words, the Harrison's Point industry. But I'm only going to show you one here today, and that is a putative arrowhead. I say putative because there's a breakdown at the bottom, which means we don't know the full extent of the length of that point. If it were twice that length, it may fit much more with the sort of morphology of similar points that came from Blombos in the Cape. The only difference being that this is a much more fragile looking point, and I don't think it would have worked very well as something that was a lot longer. What we're doing at the moment is spending quite a bit of time doing CT scanning on this to look at the morphology inside the burn point to see if we can detect impact fractures, which would confirm for us that it was used as a projectile. Maybe not as an arrowhead, but at least as a spearhead. So we're investigating that. We thought it was going to be easy. The difficulty is that we realize once we look inside this point that we don't understand the histology of the bone. We don't know what animal this bone came from, and therefore it's hard for us to go to modern collections of bone to compare the way that the canals come up within the bone to see whether what we can see really is impact scarring or whether these are canals that are part of the bone structure. If this is an arrowhead, it's the earliest one that has been found anywhere in the world, so 65,000 years ago. The implication is that people would then have been using bow and arrow hunting. From a social point of view, this is extremely different from hunting with spears. Spear hunting is something that people do collectively. It's often a social as well as an economic activity. And in many parts of Africa, particularly Central Africa, where people hunt with spears still today, and maybe with nets as well, the whole group goes out hunting. This is not something that is a traditional male activity necessarily. In Central Africa, mature women will go out with the men, and they help to drive the game into the nets where the men will finish them off with spears. And so we've got to be quite careful about the story that we impose on people in the past. Hunting with bow and arrow, however, as I said, is completely different from a social point of view. It enables a hunter to go out entirely alone. So it changes the social dynamics, or it can change the social dynamics, because it empowers a single person to go out and get the status of getting that meat. Moving on now to some residues, looking at blood and fat and collagen, ochre and plant gum. The residue analyses have been done by Marlies Lombard, and here is a diagram of one of the Skilbay points that she analysed for residues. Just to summarize very quickly, the upper part, the sharp end of this point, has animal residues on it, fat, collagen, blood, sometimes the hair, not on this particular one, whereas the base of the stone tool has plant gum and red ochre, iron oxide. And the plant gum and the ochre would have formed part of a compound adhesive that would have glued the tool onto its shaft, again presumably as a spear in this particular instance. Here are some different tools that Marlies looked at under the microscope. These are from the Harrison's-Poort segments, they're both segments. The sharp cutting edge, the curved back edge there, sharp cutting edge, the curved back edge. In this instance, you can see the red iron oxide from the ochre on this half of the tool, where it was hafted into its handle and shaft. Now mixed in with that, you look at the shiny stuff here, it was plant gum, and we have not been able yet to identify the plant gum, but the sort of thing that I've experimented with is acacia gum. It's a very well-known gum, and it would not be unlike that. Though in the Sibudu area today, there are many trees that could provide the kind of gum that would be suitable for making a compound adhesive. The other segment over here has a black residue. There's no ochre in that. And that black residue contains animal fat. And so we know that it was a different recipe of adhesive from the one with ochre. And why would people use different recipes? Well, maybe simply because of what was to hand at the time that they needed the adhesive. But I think we should also consider the possibility that people would use different glues depending on how they wanted the implement to behave when they were doing the task at hand. So an arrow, for example, the hunter might want an arrowhead to break inside the animal's flesh, causing more bleeding, leaving a trail so that the hunter could follow the animal and find it successfully. In the case of that kind of desirability, it would be best to use only plant gum with no loading agent, because plant gums like acacia are brittle, like glass, and so if you use them on their own, as soon as there's impact, they shatter like glass, and the stone tool is then released from its shaft into the animal, causing it to bleed. However, if you're dealing with a spear and you're going out for immediate face-to-face contact with a buffalo, there's no way that you want your stone tip to come off in the animal when you've got your arm back like that, waiting for another blow. You want that stone tool to be robustly attached to the shaft so that you can make repeated thrusts. And so it would make sense to use an adhesive with a loading agent. And as it happens, the red ochre is an extremely good loading agent. It helps to make the glue robust and not nearly as brittle. If you add a little dab of beeswax or a touch of animal fat, then there's also a little bit of flexibility, and that's really the perfect recipe for a robust compound adhesive. We know that people are using compound adhesives because of the residues that we find on the tools. And I think if you think about that, it is incredibly complex behavior. Because making those kinds of adhesives involves multitasking, getting all the right ingredients together, and really importantly, controlling fire, pyro-technology, needing to understand how much heat is required to dry that adhesive without making it burn or crack and drop off the stone. It's a very skilled operation. At Sibudu, a great many stone tools have adhesive traces on them. And we have had a couple where the adhesives are sufficiently thick that we're able to have chemical analysis of them. So, but that's a story for another day because we don't have the results yet. But talking about ochre, here is a moment in time at Sibudu where somebody made use of a hard, cemented white hearth, a fireplace, that maybe it got a little bit damp and then had hardened. It created a beautiful, clean, white surface for somebody to work their red ochre on. So ochre was ground and used for whatever purpose people were needing that day, and then the traces of the ochre were left behind on that clean surface that might have served as a receptacle for the ochre while people were working it. So at Sibudu we have many such moments in time, and they really are exciting because as you excavate something like that, you almost feel the presence of the people who were there on that particular occasion. But what about the animals that were hunted with some of these implements that I've been telling you about? So this is really a caricature of what the animal remains are like. The faunal remains have been analysed by Ina Pluk in Pretoria and also Jamie Clark, who's from America. Before 62,000 years ago, there was a very wide range of animals represented that people brought to the site. But it was uncommon for large animals to be represented, large things like zebra or eland. They're present, but not in great numbers. Most of the animal remains there are the blue duiker. This is the little blue duiker, and you know it only weighs about 5 kilograms. So it's not that much different from rabbits in France. Not much bigger than that. But hundreds and hundreds of those were brought back to the site. They live in the forests. They live in damp evergreen forests even today in Kwazulu-Natal. But those are not animals that you're going to dodge in between the trees with your spear. It just wouldn't make sense. The animal would get away before you could go through the trees. Also, it would be difficult to take aim with your bow and arrow to get a small animal like that running through the trees. And so the suggestion that I've made is that at this period, we're probably getting the introduction of traps in the Middle Stone Age. And they could be very simple traps that people use with a sapling, a tree sapling, that's tied, that would snap onto the animal when it came for a root or something to eat there, or if it was just simply put across the pathway where the animals repeatedly come every day. And so I think the traps are most likely to have been the method of capture for the blue duiker. But what is the supporting evidence for that? In the Howsonspoort levels between 65 and 62,000 years ago, another creature that was extremely common was the little carnivore, the mongoose. They don't occur anywhere else in the site, just in this period. Mongooses are never caught in nets. when people in Congo, for example, catch blue decker in their nets. They simply don't get trapped in that situation. But they are highly vulnerable to getting caught in traps. And so one of the main reasons really for believing that traps were being used at this time was the accidental capture of little things like mongooses and bringing them back to the site, because they have pelts that would be quite useful if you stitched them all together to make some clothing or bags. Then another animal common in this period is the bush pig. Now, bush pig is like the forest hog that you get in France. I don't know about the forest hog, but the bush pig is very dangerous. It's not something that you would light-heartedly go out with after with your spear. Because bush pig here in Africa, if you chase after them, they will run for a while, and then they turn around and they come back. And so they are extremely dangerous with their tusks. So it's far more likely that pit traps would be set for animals like that, and that maybe once caught in a pit trap, they would be finished off with a spear. At 58,000, there's a complete change in the sort of animals at Sibudu. They are now big game hunters. They're hunting things like buffalo and zebra and eland, hartebeest, and a whole range of birds. The blue duiker disappeared completely. Absolutely completely. So it's a total change. And alongside that change is a technological change towards pointed implements that would be suitable for spears for hunting these large animals, and 38 to 48,000 zebra are the most common animals there. So, change in time, in hunting patterns, in meat-getting patterns. We have shell beads at Sibudu too, just like the ones at Blombos Cave. It's a different genus, but they look very similar. And they come from 71,000 layer down here in the still bay industry. This is what they look like. You can see that's a centimeter scale, so they are mostly smaller than a centimeter or just slightly larger than a centimeter. They've been deliberately perforated. Francesco Derico thinks that a bone, sort of a pointed implement made of bone, would have been used to make that. And he's experimented with a number of shells from Belito to try to make that point. Many of these shells have ochre inside them, possibly because people strung them as necklaces, and in preparing the leather thong to make the necklace, it may have been prepared and tanned in an ochre mixture. Or the ochre may simply have been there for decoration for these beads or thong. This is a replicated necklace, replicated from the Blombos beads, but it's the sort of thing that may well have been used in the past. You can imagine making them red with ochre. It would be a very attractive ornament. But there's more to our shell bead story. I want you to have a look at the little map of the area where I found them at the site. The first thing you'll notice, these grey blobs here are big rocks that occurred within this layer, and the orangey yellow patches are fireplaces that people made. So people made their fireplaces in this cleared area away from the rocks. The stone points, like this still bare one here, are all over the place. In fact, I haven't plotted them all on this. You can see they occur in several places, even amongst the rocks. But the beads, marked in blue here, occur in less than a square meter in the site. So it looks as though either people were manufacturing them right on that spot around the fireplace, or somebody lost a necklace right there, and the beads became scattered within about half a So, another moment in time really at the site, where you can see something that happened on a particular day, 71,000 years ago. And then the last point that I'm going to be mentioning is the evidence that we have for bedding at Sibudu. But I need to explain to you first what I mean by bedding. It's not what you and I think of as bedding. And this is Chrissy Sievers, the archaeobotanist, who came up the hill from the river with a bundle of sedges. Sedges are reeds. And she demonstrated the sort of bedding that people would have made in the Middle Stone Age, simply throwing down a sheaf of the sedges to create a clean, dry place for people to sleep, but also to sit and to work when they were in the shot. Now, over time, sedges like that built up. And you can imagine people living in a rock shelter like that, throwing down their bones, having their breakfast in bed, making their stone tools, children playing around, perhaps even urinating in the bedding. It would get pretty fusty after a while. And so one of the things that we find in Sibudu is repeated burning of layers of bedding at the site. Another map to show you. Once again, the grey rocks that were probably part of the camp furniture of the site at the time that people were living there. The areas where the fireplaces were made. An ash dump where perhaps the fires were scraped out to get rid of bone and things that weren't wanted and were just dumped to one side. And then this rather interesting black patch here that when we initially excavated we thought was a mega fireplace, a mega hearth. And we subsequently discovered with micromorphology and geological means that this was in fact burnt bedding. And you can see that this is the edge of the excavation. If one were to project the size of this, it would be considerably larger than the patch that is represented in our excavation. While I was digging this particular feature, I came across a patch of burnt sedge cones, actually lying there, about 30 centimeters across, and that was really nice. Looking now in thin section, this is how the burnt grasses and the burnt sedges look under the microscope. You can actually see layers that are a centimeter thick under the microscope, comprising these burnt grasses. In amongst them are burnt sedge seeds that Christine Sievers has been able to identify, even species. And down at the bottom are phytoliths that are articulated. Now, phytoliths are the silica portions of plants that are preserved in all plants, but things like grasses and sedges have a real abundance of them. And these are articulated, showing that the layers have been undisturbed since the time that the bedding was burnt. And so throughout that amazingly colourful sequence of stratigraphy that I showed you at the beginning, there are a great many layers of burnt bedding. The bedding here is preserved earlier, once again, than anywhere else in the world. We have evidence here of bedding going back to 77,000 years ago, which is more than double the age of bedding that is being found and dated elsewhere, except maybe for deep cliff, but that is not yet being finalized. And the last bit of bedding that I'm going to show you dates to the 77,000 layers right at the base of the excavation. This is a field photograph of that bedding, and you'll need to look quite carefully at the strata here to follow this white layer, which is about a centimeter thick in all. But if you were able to look much, much closer, you would see that that white layer comprises grasses and sedge stems lying perfectly horizontally on the ground. And instead of being burnt, this particular layer has become fossilized. It comprises totally silica phytons. So that's how it looked in the field. But the greatest surprise that we got was when I was excavating an area of this and realized that there was something rather strange about this white mass that I was looking at. And so I had to get magnifying glass and lie on my stomach and look very carefully. And I could not believe what I saw under the magnifying glass. They were leaves. This is how the leaves looked. You can see the central vein, the midrib here. And if you look at this one here, you can see the midrib with veins leading out to the side. And if you're able to see very well from where you are, you can even see the oil cells and the stomata preserved on these leaves. This is a field photograph. It's not under the microscope. This one is under the microscope. But looking from a distance, just down into the excavation, this is how it looked. Just like a white mass. So you had to really get up close to see what it was. I was able to remove these leaves in plaster of Paris jackets and take them back to the laboratory where Marion Bamford, the paleobotanist at Wits, after a long effort at looking at comparative collections, was able to identify these leaves with 100% certainty to an indigenous species called Cryptocarya woodii, which is a wild camphor tree in English. Now this is a tree that in the wild has leaves that are aromatic, but they're also poisonous. Mildly poisonous. There are 4 species of Cryptocarya in KwaZulu-Natal. This one is the least toxic of all of them. The others all occur in the Sibudu area as well. And I would hesitate, but not really, to tell you that I think people probably at this time understood the properties of these plants. And they knew that these were toxic enough to dispel mosquitoes, but not toxic enough that if the babies chewed on them, they would die. And so we have here not only the oldest bedding in the world, but also the oldest evidence for the use of insecticides, because all of the leaves spread well over a couple of meters in the bedding area were of the same species. Now you need to realize that along the extent of the cliff today, there are 400 woody species that occur outside Sibudu. Almost as many species as in the whole of Europe. Right? Woody species, tree species, I think so. Very, very rich. Now if this was a leaf fall, if the leaves had blown in accidentally, I would expect a whole range of leaves. Or even 2 or 3 different kinds of leaves that blew in. There was only one species of evergreen leaf laid over the sedges and grasses. So I think that's a pretty exciting story, and that's where I'm going to stop my story today and hand over to Leo. But thanks to all the people who've helped to make this research